The question arises every year, what to call the object that we light on Hanukkah? Is it a menorah, as most people around me call it? Is it a Hanukkah, which I often call it, with the response of stairs? Or a Hanukkiyah, which it's often called by Israelis? And does it even matter what we call this candelabra that we light on Hanukkah? It seems like a very simple question, but there's actually quite a lot written on this topic, both within rabbinics and within academia. And I'd like to dive into this. And we're going to address all three of these names and also the topic of its relevance and importance. So first, let's look at the early mentions of the lighting of Hanukkah and to see what it's called within these sources. So firstly, it's important to note that we don't have so many early sources. Hanukkah is almost completely missing from the Mishnah and from the Talmud. There's very scant reference to it. Here we have within the Mishnah, our earliest source of our Torah Shebe'al Peh, a reference to the candles, the lighting, the wicks of Hanukkah. Here it's in a very particular context of damages in Masechet Baba Kama. And we'll go to the end. And here you have it. But if the shopkeeper, talking about responsibility for damages, but if the shopkeeper left his light outside, now this wasn't obviously a LED light, right, or an incandescent bulb, this was an actual flame. So the shopkeeper left his light, an actual flame outside, the shopkeeper is liable for leaving an open flame. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it was a Hanukkah light, he is not liable. So not to get into the technicalities of it, but what does he call it here? Does he call it a menorah or a Hanukkiyah? He calls it Ner Hanukkah, the light of Hanukkah. One light of Hanukkah. Is that indicative of whether it's a menorah, Hanukkah, or a Hanukkiyah? Initially, you might say, yes, Rabbi, it is, because it's a Ner Hanukkah. He's lighting one wick of this Hanukkah, and the Hanukkah being the object that he's lighting. But that's not necessarily correct, because you also could read it Ner, right, being the wick of Hanukkah. That is lit on the holiday of Hanukkah. He could have, or she could have, their regular lamp that they normally light, and on Hanukkah, light it for the purpose of lighting the light of Hanukkah, and thereby it would be called Ner Hanukkah. And so from here, our earliest source in the Mishnah, we have no indication of what to call this candelabra. Is it a Hanukkah? Is it a menorah, Hanukkah, or Hanukkiyah? We don't know. Next source. This is a Beraita found in the Talmud, also contemporaneous with the time of the Mishnah, and also only called Ner Hanukkah. You have Masechtot Ketanot, which is a little bit later, but also here, no indication of any type of candelabra, at least not by name. It's called Ner Hanukkah, a light of Hanukkah. How many lights of Hanukkah we're talking about? At least one. Which brings to mind the very idea that we don't need a candelabra. The concept of having a menorah is not one that is necessary, because at the core of the mitzvah is one wick for each household. And so all you need is your ordinary lamp to light for the mitzvah of Hanukkah, and you don't need the candelabra. And so for many, there may not have even been this object to worry about what to call it. It was just simply, I'm lighting for the holiday of Hanukkah, Ner Hanukkah. The same is true within Rambam, going all the way to the 12th century. En madlikin nerot Hanukkah, kodem shetishkah hama. A person should not light the lights of Hanukkah before it's dark outside, before sunset. You have to wait till after sunset to do your lighting. Now, what is he lighting? Again, it's Nerot Hanukkah, the wicks, the lights of Hanukkah. But that doesn't indicate any object that was made specifically for the holiday of Hanukkah. But we notice something very interesting, and this was pointed out by Rabbi Rasabi, who is a Yemenite rabbi in Israel, who I'm going to be bringing some sources from, that the title of the section of Harambam is indicative. He says that Harambam calls this section Hilchot Megillah veHanukkah. Is Megillah the name of the holiday, or is Megillah the name of the object? Very clearly, Megillah is the name of the object that one utilizes on the holiday of Purim. And so then the question comes up, is Hanukkah the name of the holiday, or is it the name of the object that one lights? Rabbi Rasabi wanted to argue that Hanukkah here, just like Megillah, is referring to the object that you light, and not just to the name of the holiday. And he brings some additional evidence to this. He notes that it could have said Megillah v'ner Hanukkah, as we said before. Or it could have said Purim veHanukkah, if we're talking about the holiday. But it says Megillah veHanukkah, the Megillah being the object and Hanukkah being the object. So Rabbi Rasabi wants to say, what do we call this candelabra that you light? He said, we call it the Hanukkah, at least according to Harambam. Now, that's a very nice piece of evidence to bring for an argument. It's definitely not conclusive, but that's a very nice idea, right? Megillah being the object for Purim, it's not called Purim, it's called the holiday. And Hanukkah, not only as the name of the holiday, but here as the name of the object that we like. Some more evidence to this is, for example, he has a section of Sukkot where it's talking about the object of Sukkot, right, Lulav and the shofar. Those are all the objects, as opposed to the day itself. So that would be some evidence for it being Hanukkah. In Shulchan Aruch, what is it called? Simply Nerot Hanukkah, the lights of the Hanukkah. Now, is this specifically the candelabra, or like we said before, any light that you light for Hanukkah? Another piece that we should look at is the beracha that we recite on Hanukkah. We say, Asher Kiddeshanu b'mesotav etzivanu lehadlik ner Hanukkah, or ner shel Hanukkah. So here, is Hanukkah referring to the object that you light, or is it the light that's lit on the holiday of Hanukkah? Now, the argument could be made both ways. It sounds like ner shel Hanukkah, the light that is kindled on the holiday of Hanukkah. And so far from the first 6 sources, we don't have very strong evidence for the name of the candelabra that we're lighting on the day, until source number 7. This brings us to Baghdad, the Ben Ish Hai. Here he says very, very clearly in his book of Halacha, when you place the Hanukkah, what's the Hanukkah? It's very clear here he's not talking about placing the holiday. Very clearly he's talking about placing the object, al mezuzat petach, right, on the we call that the side of the doorpost, right? Right? So he tells us about where to place it. Okay. And again, he calls it the Hanukkah. So now very clearly we have evidence for the candelabra being called a Hanukkah in the Sephardic community of Baghdad. This is by the Ben Ish Hai. Amazingly, and this is also from Rabbi Rasabi, who I told you I'm going to bring some sources from, it's identified, the Hanukkah is identified the candelabra is identified as a Hanukkah in the Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi is earlier than the Talmud Bavli by about 100 years. Ve'od min hadha, we're not going to go through the whole thing, but he says here that she'asur lir'ot matbea le'ora Hanukkah. It is forbidden to look at a coin with the light of the Hanukkah. It's the light of the holiday. Obviously, the Yerushalmi is talking about the light of the Hanukkah being an object. And so now we have two sources that point rather strongly to the candelabra being called a Hanukkah. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard that before, of saying we're going to go light at the Hanukkah, but that's what would have been said seemingly by the Ben Ish Hai and those in the Yerushalmi. But what about a Hanukkiyah? Israelis call the candelabra a Hanukkiyah, and it sounds like Hanukkah that we've brought some evidence for. Hanukkiyah emerged rather late. Hebrew was almost lost from the common people until more recently with the establishment, essentially, of the State of Israel, right before the establishment of the State of Israel with the Ben Yehuda family. His wife, and this is from Misrad HaChinuch, the Department of Education in Israel, that Ben Yehuda's wife publicized in 1897 the calling of this candelabra as a Hanukkiyah. But it's interesting to note that her husband, who wrote a Hebrew dictionary, never called it a Hanukkiyah. Rather, he called it a Menorah Hanukkah, because you have various different types of menorot. You have a menorah, a candelabra, that could be for Shabbat. There are those I'm sure you've seen who have 4-stem candelabras, I guess, that they light on Shabbat or sometimes more. But this one specifically is menorah of Hanukkah. It's the candelabra of Hanukkah. But his wife, she published that it should be called a Hanukkiyah. In Bar Ilan University, there was an article published about the term, the identification of the Hanukkah, I'm calling it the Hanukkah because that's what we've established so far, being called the Hanukkiyah. And so first she mentions the history, as we said before, that the wife of Ben Yehuda established this term of Hanukkiyah. But then she says something really interesting. She says, I'm not sure if she actually just made this up, if she was the inventor of calling the object a Hanukkiyah. Or maybe it was taken from Spanish, or more particularly Ladino. As she said earlier, it is what it was called by the Spanish Jews, the Ladino Jews in Eretz Yisrael, that she would have been in touch with, that she would have been surrounded by. And she may have heard them calling that object not a Hanukkiyah, but a Hanukkiyah. I think that's how you say it in Ladino, but I'm probably saying it wrong. I think it's a Hanukkiyah, something like that. And now this professor brings more evidence to it, that this was the way that it was described and called in the tradition in Saloniki. And there were also various poems and songs that called it a Hanukkiyah. And so Hanukkiyah, as many would say, it's just Israeli, it's modern Hiloni. They would say that it's not religious. It's not a religious way of calling it. We have to call it, most people would say, a menorah or a Hanukkah, which we have evidence for. But definitely don't call it a Hanukkiyah. But it's interesting to note that there were communities that had called it by this name way before what most people think that it was established by the wife of Ben Yehuda. By communities in Greece and communities in Turkey and Saloniki, and they all called it Hanukkiyah. This is also verified as well by Rabbi Yitzhak Rasabi, who I mentioned before, and he says, she didn't make this up. This was taken from the Spanish-speaking communities, the Ladino communities. Kegon, for example, Yavan Veturkia, and the Greek communities, as well as the Turkish communities. The communities that speak Ladino. Okay, and it goes on a little bit more, but he wants to articulate not like how it was in the article that we had just looked at, that actually it was with a kof, and she had heard it with a chaf, or could not differentiate between a kof and a kaf, and thereby they did not actually preserve it, but she may have heard it that way, and that's why she said, you know what, that's a nice way to call it, and so I am going to publicize that it should be called the Hanukkiyah. But what about a menorah? We haven't seen anything about calling it a menorah, and I think that's probably the most popular name that I've actually heard it called. And he's right. We should point out that Hanukkiyah that we find within the Hebrew language has no foundation, no source in the words of our rabbis, in the Talmud, or even within the poskim, meaning the Rishonim. And maybe this is just a made-up word. And so that's why it is appropriate and correct to call it by the name that we are accustomed to from early Menorah, or Menorat Hanukkah, or the Menorah specifically of Hanukkah. It's a very, very interesting idea he brings here from the Hatam Sofer, that instead of utilizing Hebrew words and adapting and shifting and changing Hebrew to meet our modern linguistic needs, it's better to import a foreign word. But don't invent new words within the Hebrew language. Meaning, don't use the Hebrew shoresh, the Hebrew root, and thereby manipulate it to fulfill our modern needs within our language. Because they didn't want to change or to add to the language that the Torah was given in. Because this language has great depth within its grammar, and we have to be very, very careful with making grammatical changes to its words. And thereby, utilizing the Hatam Sofer, some want to state that you should not call it a Hanukkiyah, a Hanukkiyah. So why are some opposed to calling it a menorah? There are some who absolutely will not call it a menorah. And that's based on, goes all the way back to the earliest source, is a Beraita from the Mishnaic time period, which states that you cannot create any vessels in the likeness of the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash. This is from the Shulchan Aruch. Lo yaseh bait tavnit hechal. Kishior gobho ve'orko ve'rochbo achsadera ve'rochbo achsadera tavnit ulam. Right? Even the structure of your home should not be made in the same structure as the hechal of the Beit HaMikdash. Haser tavnit azara, and all the various components of it, whether as per the structure of the various parts of it, or even the vessels. For example, don't have a table, a shulchan, in the structure of the shulchan of the Beit HaMikdash. Menorah, tavnit menorah, and don't have a candelabra in the structure of the candelabra of the Beit HaMikdash. But that shouldn't be a problem here, as it continues. Well, how many arms were there in the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash? There were 7. And clearly here in the Shulchan Aruch and the earlier sources, if it's not in the same structure as it was in the Beit HaMikdash, that's not a problem. You could make it of 5 arms, or 6 arms, or 8 arms. But if it's 7, you shall not make it. Even of any other type of metal besides gold. And that's even if it wasn't the same kind of beautiful design as it was in the menorah, with the flowers, etc. Okay. And this is the earlier source from the Talmud Bavli, which I brought here. But we kind of summed that up nicely within the Shulchan Aruch. But that argument shouldn't really hold of not calling it a menorah, because then you might get confused with the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. Firstly, like we said, we have 8. If you're going to build it in the structure that we're used to, there'll be 8 arms. And in many communities, when they made this type of structure, they made it in very different artistic ways. These are just 2 that don't look anything like the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. Therefore, it's not the tavnit, the structure, as the same structure was in the Beit HaMikdash. So why would I get confused if I call it a menorah? Now, some might argue that you would get confused because it's so similar, but the structure is not similar. But they're uncomfortable, so they want to call it a menorah Hanukkah and not the menorah, in case somebody may think that you actually have a replica of the menorah at your house that you're lighting. Okay, with that argument, we had a shulchan in the Beit HaMikdash, which means a table, had a very particular structure to it. There are 12 shelves. Now, my table at home doesn't have 12 shelves. But when I'm talking to my daughter in Hebrew, I'm going to utilize the word shulchan to refer to the table. And I have no worry or doubt that she will confuse the shulchan with the shulchan of the Beit HaMikdash, because obviously they're 2 very different things and structured completely differently. But yet, there were many that were uncomfortable with calling the candelabra for Hanukkah the menorah, because of the halakha that we just mentioned above. And so one of those individuals, right, was the Hida. The Hida, Rabbi David Haim Yosef David Azulai. He was a very famous rabbi, originally from Yerushalayim, but he did a lot of travel. And he does not call it a menorah. He calls it Menorah Hanukkah. It's the menorah of Hanukkah. And I don't see that he says here that specifically of a reason, but that may be the reason of why he wouldn't just call it a menorah, because it's specifically the menorah of Hanukkah. It's not just any menorah. It's definitely not the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. It's specifically the menorah for Hanukkah. So does it matter? Now, to be honest, when I started this class, I had in my mind that the only name for this candelabra object was the Hanukkah. In my mind, when I started this class, the only reference that I knew of it from the Mishnaic times all the way through till Shulchan Aruch was Ner Hanukkah, Nerot Hanukkah. I said, okay, so that's then thereby I should call it Nerot Hanukkah or Ner Hanukkah, or I'm going to light the Hanukkah. If I want to say lighting in English and call the object Hanukkah. I was very clear that it was Hanukkah. But as I started to think about it, it's not necessarily so clear that it's only called a Hanukkah from those earlier sources, because they could be read as the Ner of the holiday, the light of the holiday of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah, not necessarily talking about the object, but rather the holiday. And I see what Rabbi Ratzavi was saying, that it could have been the Rambam called Hanukkah based on the title and is talking to the object, I could hear that. But in its actual halachot, I haven't found the evidence to it. The stronger evidence that I found now was within the Ben Ish Hai and in Yerushalmi, and that really backed that up. Hanukkiyah, I thought completely was off. I said, that's modern Israeli. There's no way that that's the right title for it. And then I saw this academic professor of Semitic languages from Bar Ilan and Rabbi Ratzabi. I said, no, that's Ladino. There are communities that have been doing this for at least 200 years, maybe longer. Okay, so that's really interesting. And then I said, okay, but there's no way that you could call this object a menorah, because has v'shalom, that anybody is going to think that I am lighting an object, which is the candelabra of the Beit HaMikdash, that I've made a replica of it in my home, and I've transgressed in order to fulfill a mitzvah, chas v'shalom. So why am I calling this a menorah? It's definitely not the menorah. It's not the structure of the menorah. It doesn't have 7 arms. It's not the height of it. But then that same argument could be utilized in the reverse. So since it's not tavnit menorah, it's not the structure of the menorah, specifically because of that example, it's very clear that it's not referring to the menorah. And it's the holiday of Hanukkah, and they know what you're talking about when you tell me you're going to light the menorah. So does it matter what we call it? So I think it does, and I want to articulate why. I think it matters when we think about what the actual miracle was. What is it that we are celebrating? And I think it's so much more broad than just the lighting of the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. I think it's so much more broad than just finding a flask of pure oil. Yes, that's a great miracle, but a miracle for then. What relevancy does this have for me now? God did many, many miracles. We don't have holidays for them. And is that a national miracle? They could have used a different oil. If everything is tameh and all the people are tameh, could have used a different oil. Did it have to last 8 days? Maybe they could have waited a couple of days longer. It's been a really long time since they've lit the menorah. You can't wait 8 days to light it till it takes time to travel and come back. I mean, what's the huge big deal about the oil? I'm sorry if I'm presenting it in a way that anyone's taking negatively. I think it's a wonderful, amazing miracle. I'm not sure that if we only focus on that miracle, we have enough reason to have a holiday that's lasted us almost 2,000 years. And so I think by calling it the menorah, we're only focusing on that miracle. And we're missing the picture. But if you call it a Hanukkah or a Hanukkiyah, and I'm going to actually prefer the Hanukkah, unless you speak Ladino, and thereby, because you speak Ladino, you want to say Hanukkiyah, that's fine. By saying Hanukkah, you're recognizing the broader miracle that still has relevancy for us today. There are loads of sources on this. I have an article on this. You see this throughout all of our sources, and it answers all of the questions about why Al-Hanisim, for example, does not focus on the oil. Why most of our sources do not focus on the oil. We have in the Gemara focuses on the oil, for example, which is a good discussion of why. But besides for that, Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2, written, I think, pretty sure by Jews, close to that time period, that's not the focus. Josephus, that's not the focus. And also these other Jewish sources, for example, Midrash, the Sikta Rabbati from the Gaonic period, also is not focused only on the oil and on the menorah. And so I have it here in English. Why do we light candles on Hanukkah? It commemorates a time when the Hashmonean sons of the high priest were victorious over the Greek kingdom, as it is written, and your sons of Sion who were victorious over the sons of Greece. They entered the temple and they found 8 iron spits. They affixed them and lit candles upon them. So what's the miracle there? The miracle is not just the oil. The oil is actually very significant, and I'll tell you why in a second. But the focus here was the victory, the military victory, the regaining of our central governing entity. We regained our sovereignty. We reestablished the Beit HaMikdash and its proper functioning. And so the lighting of the menorah was actually the finalization of the properly functioning Beit HaMikdash. And it didn't happen right away. And I'm going to show you this, although there are many, many more sources. I'm going to show you this to you just from Maharasha, because I think he lays it out very, very nicely. Hanukkah. It seems appropriate to explain that this holiday is called Hanukkah, Al Shem Hanukkah HaMizbeach. Why is the day called Hanukkah? And I think we should call our lighting, whatever we light, our Hanukkah, because it represents Hanukkah HaMizbeach, the dedication of the altar, meaning the reestablishment of our Jewish practice in the state of Israel on a national level, in our national institution of the Beit HaMikdash. Right? And why, now how does he explain the Gemara, which talks about the miracle of the oils, which says, my Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah all about? He said, well, that's focusing on why do we have the mitzvah to light? So the lighting is specifically because of the miracle. But there's a much bigger picture here. The whole holiday is because of the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, let's take this a little further. If we wanted the miracle to solely be the lighting of the menorah, or mostly focused on the miracle, wouldn't the structure of the mitzvah be more focused on lighting similarly to how the lighting of the menorah, the Beit HaMikdash, was? If you look at the actual mitzvah of the lighting of the, call it the menorah, call it the Hanukkah, it's one light. And it's only for a very short period. Originally, from sunset for another 30 minutes. That's it. That doesn't reflect the lighting of the menorah at all. What it more reflects is a victory symbol. And so I didn't bring those sources here. I bring them in an article that I'm pointing to, where in order to celebrate and show alliance after a military victory, you lit candles. And so it could have been, and I actually really do think it was, that this lighting, specifically at that time period, and with so many of the other details of the mitzvot, was specifically outdoors to show your allegiance to those who won during the military victory. Because originally it was a civil war between those Jews who wanted to align with the Greeks and brought the Greeks in, and thought that Judaism was bringing darkness into the world, and therefore we need to bring Greek culture to bring light. And those Jews who thought that the Torah is ner mitzvah v'torah or, is an illumination to the world. And so when you light this ner, this candle, this wick, initially just a single wick, even on day number 8, outside your home, just for this 30-minute time, it's not even that dark outside that you need it for light. It's very clear that it's a symbol for your allegiance to the Torah and mitzvot that was established, to this vision of the Beit HaMikdash being an or legoim, being a light unto the nations. And so I really like to call the candelabra, the object that we light, the Hanukkah. Because I think it zooms us back to the bigger picture that was happening. Not just the miracle that took place in the Beit HaMikdash with a few Kohanim, but rather the larger miracle that Judaism was absolutely almost lost. The Beit HaMikdash was run by corrupt Kohanim. Most Jews throughout the land were not following Torah Mitzvot because they didn't see it as valuable. Our main institutions were completely corrupt. And we won. We retook the Beit HaMikdash, our institutions, and a lot of the country, and brought it under our vision of the Torah as a model nation for the entire world. That we are the ones that are enlightening the Greeks and not the other way around. They need to learn from us the way that we run our society. And so by calling it Hanukkah, I'm showing my allegiance to this rededication, because I am lighting the light, remembering the rededication of what we once did, and remembering that even now, my family, like the family of the Hashmonaim, can be the light. And so while I showed that it's okay to call it a Menorah, and in Ladino it was called a Hanukkiyah, I find it most appropriate to call it a Hanukkah for all the reasons that I just mentioned. Hanukkah Sameach.